Hi, it's Ryan, and today I want to talk about roll cages. So, I get a lot of people who ask me questions about recommendations on roll cages, if I can help them with roll cages, and what I think they should do with the direction of their car. And I try and give the same advice, even though I can't tell people, like, I don't feel like I can tell people what they should do with their car, but I try and give people advice that kind of steer them in the right direction, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So first, I want to talk about what kind of cage is right for you. The biggest question I get all the time is I have people say, hey, should I get a bolt-in cage? Should I get a 4-point cage? Should I get a 6-point cage? Or should I do like a full-on rally cage? And I think one of the things that everybody has to keep in mind is that what are you going to do with the car? Are you going to just autocross the car? Do you want a little bit more stability with a harness? Do you want just rollover protection? Do you think that maybe you want rollover protection right now, but in the future you see yourself going to do hill climbs? Those are the kind of questions that I think everybody should ask themselves, and you as a viewer should ask yourself too if you're thinking about it. That being said, the way to think about it is if, and this is the usually the answer I get is that I don't want to fully commit to the car yet, but I want to be safe. So a lot of people want to know if a weld-in 4-point roll bar is the way to go for them. And typically, I mean, not typically, it could be. That's the answer. It could be the way to go, but maybe not. So here's things to think about are why do you want a roll bar to start? Most people want roll bars because they want better rollover protection. Some people want roll bars because they also want a harness. Some people want roll bars so they can have better head and neck restraint using a Hans with a harness. Those are all good reasons for roll bars. Things that roll bars don't do well is they don't protect you very well, if at all, on side impact. So if you are thinking that maybe eventually you'll take your car to do some wheel-to-wheel racing, then just a regular roll bar probably isn't the way you want to go because of the cost and things of that sort. Another question that I usually ask people is, when do you think you'll do this? Or what kind of racing do you eventually want to do? Maybe you're doing autocross or track attack or something, and you want to get into full-on road racing. And in that case, or maybe, yeah, full-on road racing, or maybe you plan to do a hill climb with a car someday. Another question I ask people is, do you think you're going to do something beyond autocross, or maybe you're going to do something beyond just even time attack? So they have to think about it, and it's something anybody should be thinking about. But what essentially, the reason I ask them that is that once you do a weld-in roll bar, which is a great option, to go to a 6-point to do say like I have here where you've got side protection and you've got better rollover protection, something that you would need for like the basics of wheel to wheel. Typically, most cage builders will cut the old cage out and then start over again. That's what Brian from the Denver Donut Shop, who did my cage, recommended, and or at least told me that was typically what would have to happen. And that gets expensive and adds up. Another option is sometimes people can cut the roofs off of the car and then convert a 4-point weld in to a 6-point weld in, but that doesn't necessarily mean that. There's several different types of cages, but for the most part, you've got a bolt-in cage and you've got a weld-in cage. Now, a weld-in cage is always going to be stronger. It's going to be more structurally sound. It's going to make the car feel stiffer. And in general, it's the safer cage between a bolt-in cage and a weld-in cage. The downsides of a weld-in cage is that it's permanent. Another downside of a weld-in cage is that whatever you decide to do, with the exception of cutting it out and putting another something in, you have to be sure that you know what you're going to do or what you're planning to do with the car, which is a reason why I usually ask people what their long-term goals are with the car. Even they just expect it. Um, the advantages of a bolt-in cage is that your typical DIYer can install a bolt-in cage. We did a full 6-point bolt-in cage in Jeanette's BRZ, and that was a cage that was built by an Australian company. And that cage was super nice. It was like three-dimensional, and it was on some aspects of it is almost borderline what my cage builder would like to see in a cage. But it had the right backing plates, it had the right hardware size and stuff for a NASA event. But ultimately, the cage was still pretty pricey. It was a $2,000 cage. So $2,000 6-point cage, you have, and I think this goes across the board. If you're doing a bolt-in cage, you have to think about, you have to consider that you're going to have to do it. To buy a bolt-in cage and then pay someone else to install it, it's going to cost you more than a weld-in cage is likely. Um, the thing that's kind of scary about that is that the cages you're putting in the car is you're putting in the car, and you have the potential to make mistakes, or like the safety and the rollover protection. A lot of that really is part of the integrity of the install. I think on Jeanette's cage, on her 6-point cage, it took me about 12 hours of labor, but a big part of that was taking the interior out, cleaning the floors, getting some of the material out of it, welding the sub harnesses in, and like the plates, getting the cage actually in there and fitted. We kind of experimented with a couple of different things, like keeping the as much of the interior we could in there, and then bolting it all down and making sure everything was dialed in there, and then trying to get the interior all back around it. So if if you were just taking the interior out of your car and installing a bolt-in cage, and you're relatively handy with tools, you could probably install a cage like that, even with a friend's help, in probably 6 to 8 hours. So that's something to keep in mind, that if you're considering a bolt-in cage, you should consider installing it yourself just off of cost. And that brings me back to, that's an advantage. A bolt-in cage is something that a competent DIYer could do and save themselves a little bit of money. Now, there's definitely cheaper cages. There's definitely car platforms out there that are more like S chassis and stuff that have a lot of options and stuff for them, and even some of the Civics and things. But what's super, super, super important is that you do your research for what you anticipate what you're going to do before you purchase something, and make sure that you know that the thickness of the tubing is right for the weight of the car, the backing plates are thick enough, and the build orientation is correct. Now, if you are just installing, say, I'll use Ryan Sotak as an example. Ryan Sotak wanted to install a 4-point roll bar in his car, in his BMW, and those are really common. And he wanted to know if he should do a weld-in or a bolt-in. And he says that eventually, when I ask him, these qualifying questions, or when other people are asking him, are you planning on doing road racing, like fender to fender with the car? How important is side impact to you? Things like that. He said, eventually he'd like to get into that thing. So when you talk about putting a 4-point cage in there, and even Brian Acton chimed up, like, you're talking about cutting it out and doing it over again to do your 6-point. And when it came down to that, like, if you want some rollover protection, a little bit better rollover protection, harnesses and things like that, for him, a bolt-in cage was the right answer, because then he can remove the bolt-in cage by itself, install it by himself, and then when he's ready to go to like a 6-point like we have here, then he only has to pay for just the installation of the cage and the build of the cage. Now, to save money, you should always think about what your long-term goal is and pay for that one time and then be done with it. I understand too, trying to work with the cage when you want to have interior and stuff like that. I understand that aspect too. So one of the advantages, again, about the bolt-in cage is that it's cost effective as long as you're installing it. If you're paying a shop 10 hours to install a cage at $125 or $140 an hour, and you're paying $2,000 for the cage for a 6-point, now you're talking about you likely could have had a weld-in, like a superior weld-in cage done for that price. So another, so back to the advantages. The advantage of a bolt-in cage is that when you go, if you sell the car or you want to transfer the cage out or whatever, you can remove the cage without it being a crazy ordeal. Whereas removing this cage, I mean, it's part of the car now. I mean, big giant plates welded to the back of the car. You know, everything's MIG'd and TIGGed, super tight tolerances in all these different ways. I mean, it's a tight cage. So taking a weld-in cage out of a car is not really doable, and transferring that to another car for any reason is really not doable. It's definitely been done. It's definitely out there, but that brings me, when we talk about cost, that brings me to the next cost. People ask me what I think the going rate is for certain cages in cars. I do think it's probably important to take a couple considerations with the weld-in cage. One, you want to have your seat. The biggest reason you want to have your seat is so that they can set the harness bar at the right height. Two, you want to pull all the interior, as much of the interior as you can pull out, maybe short of the dash, out of the car as you can. That's going to save you labor on the install, and you don't want to pay somebody $100+ an hour to take out plastic pens and carpet and stuff. And then the next thing to really consider is that when you're doing a cage like this, you have to think about what you want to do and which direction you want to go. So that brings me to the cost aspect. So provided your interior is out, provided you've got your seat in, in this case, this seat's a $1,300 seat, you're going to factor that in, but you're probably going to want that no matter what. Once you get all that specced out, you're looking at, basically, this is loosely pricing. These are your loose prices to expect on, say, like a sedan or something. Now, like a Miata or an S2000 could be cheaper or could be more expensive. I know like an S2000, if you want to do like a roll bar that's with the harnesses, you have to take the top out, whether it's a bolt-in or not. I mean, it's definitely labor intensive. So we'll just assume 4-door sedan, like my car here, and with the heavy duty tubing. So this is the tubing for a car that's basically 3,000 pounds or more. And we just went that way. The car weighs over 3,000 pounds right now. We wanted to get under that, but that's neither here nor there. So typically, I think what you can expect to do on a 4-point price range wise, on the cheap end of a roll bar, like a 4-point roll bar, which is basically your main hoop here, and these down joints, they go to the back. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, and then a harness bar, and then a crossbar. And the crossbar is to stabilize the roll bar from getting kicked in or something. So that you can expect to probably pay somewhere in the neighborhood of $1,200 to $1,500 installed, somewhere in that neighborhood. It could be a little bit more, could be less. If you go to a 6-point, like I have here, your typical 6-point cage is going to run you about $3,500 to $5,500, maybe even more, maybe closer to $6,000. But that gives you side protection for the impact. You've got bars that come down here and go straight to the floor. So you've got 6 points when you add those 4 back there, and these 2 points on both sides, and it gives you side protection. So if a car hits you or you hit up against something, and time trials, that's not common. Time trials is not common to get a car that hits you. It can happen, but whereas wheel to wheel, you definitely could have a car that hits you in the side. So that gives you side protection here. And you've got this bar here so that if you have a rollover that's going down basically the A-pillar here, it's going to give you some more crash protection in the event of the roller. It'll stabilize the front of the car, so it'll actually be on the roll bars instead of having the windshield cave in on you. So that's going to be about $3,500 to $6,000 depending on the build out. And I know that's a huge range, and it's a big jump from a 4-point roll bar to a 6-point. But the 6-point comes with a ton of labor. They have to take the dash out, fit the dash in and out. Unless you don't want the dash in, that could save you some. It doubles the material to getting it up inside here, and the time it takes to weld everything is a lot. They typically will build it from the front back instead of from the back forward. So typically, like, that whole process takes a lot more effort and a lot more time, but you have a far superior product over just your regular 4-point roll bar. I mean, the roll bar gives you harnesses potentially, some rollover, and some rear impact protection, but not much, and some chassis stiffening. Whereas now you're spreading that chassis stiffening on a 6-point all the way up to the front of the car. You got the side protection on both sides, and the roof protection. And then that brings us to the most expensive cage, and that's going to be your FIA kind of homologated. We'll call it just a rally cage. It's the crazy cage that is just super bananas. And if you go off a cliff, like a Pikes Peak or something, it's going to be the cage that keeps you from dying. So those cages will usually start in the neighborhood of $6,000-7,000 on like a really small car, and work. It could be well over 12 grand, $16,000, depending on the type of car you have. So like an all steel body car like this, where they don't have to find weird tie-in points and stuff. I mean, it sounds normal, right? Like that's going to be a little bit cheaper. But then you've got the material costs if you have to run the thick bars, and so you have the material cost is going to be added into it, and you got the weight that's going to be added into it, and it does take a lot more effort fitting that cage in. Whereas you go to something really exotic like a Porsche or an Audi, where you've got like mixed components of steel, stamped aluminum, cast aluminum, and all these other things that you're trying to tie into, that ends up becoming extremely labor intensive. So your typical FIA roll cage, that's approved for rally, or in this case that we're talking big hill climbs, the end all cage, you are looking at close to, upwards of over $10,000. And these are hard numbers for people. These are hard numbers for people to take in. I'll throw up a video here and some pictures of Scotty's car. But Scott Musgrove, who works for Flatirons Tuning, took on the task of basically taking his whole car apart, removing as much weight as he could from the interior of the car and the exterior of the car and the chassis of the car, stitch welding the entire car back together, stitch like seam welding everything. And then he did, and you can see in the pictures, a full FIA style rally cage. And the biggest reason he went so extreme on trying to remove weight was so that he could go one diameter or thickness size down, so that he would actually save even more weight on top of that. A cage like this cage in this car it's about 130 pounds of material. In Jeanette's, and this is a weld-in 6-point. In Jeanette's car, she has a 6-point. It's all bolt together, and her cage actually weighs about 150 pounds. So it actually weighs a little bit more than this one. I'm gonna sneeze. Corona. Okay, SWAT team didn't come and get me. So yeah, and then I'll put up, here's a little picture, a couple of pictures and some video of Jeanette's cage that we did in her BRZ. You can see that some of the parts are thicker in her car, to try and box it and try and make it stronger so that it could get close to the strength of this. And they got some extra weird bends in it, but nothing super crazy, nothing to super worry about. But like I said, that's a cage that took me about 12 hours to install it, and it was still, I think, about $2,000 to buy it. So still kind of an expensive cage. The next thing to think about when you're doing a cage, or if you're having, say now you've decided, okay, Ryan, I want to do at least wheel to wheel with NASA or SCCA. I'm building a T3 car, or I'm building a GTS 2 car or something, whatever it is. I want to go that route, and I'm okay paying somebody to do it. What do I need to know when I take my car to tell them? So first off, you want to make sure that they have the most recent, basically standards. You could see like standards where the size of the cage, the thickness of the bars for the weight, the crossbars, and things of that sort. And you want to consider all the organizations that you're going to race with so that you can cross-reference bar sizes so that you're not too thin in any one given spot. So say, maybe in one organization, the weight threshold's to 2,500 pounds, and then say in another organization, that threshold's up to 3,000 pounds. Well, if your car's, say 2,700 pounds, it might debate on which car or which bar thickness you go to. You have to err unfortunately, on the heavier side. So you want to pick a cage builder who's done cages for at the bare minimum to the series that you want to race with. You also want to make sure that the cage that you're running is like that you do your research too. You can't go into, typically, in my opinion anyway, unless you have somebody you trust, like the Denver Donut Shop, for example. You have somebody that builds cages for the people that you race with, and you don't have to worry about it as much. But if you're trying to find somebody local to you, say you're in Florida or Ohio or something, make sure that when you're talking to these guys, that you know at least roughly what size tubing you need, you know roughly what the design should look like, and that they know all that stuff too. So when you're talking to them, you're feeling them out a little bit. I mean, it could be a $6,000 investment in a car that you're putting it in there because you might wreck it. So you want to make sure that not only does it save your life, but that you can actually do the stuff with the car that you want to. So you might be asking yourself, Ryan, I just want to do time attack. I don't see me doing anything else. I see that you just do time attack. Why do you have such a big cage? Well, for me, a big part of it didn't take much convincing to talk about side impact. And it didn't take much convincing to talking about the structural rigidity. So on my car and on Jeanette's car, I noticed the difference on the sharpness of the car, the turning of the car. The car physically felt like everything was happening sooner. So for me, when you race a car a long time, whether it's time trials or time attack or autocross or whatever, it does start to wear and flex on the car. So kind of the way that Brian presented it to me is, hey, if you're going to spend a lot of money on drivetrain, you're going to spend a lot of money on engine, suspension, tires, events, you want to, and you don't want to wreck, because obviously we don't want to wreck, you want to invest in the chassis. Something like this 6-point roll bar here is going to extend the life of this chassis maybe a decade, or maybe even longer than that, maybe almost indefinitely, because it's going to help resist that twisting force that you get from racing. So for me, and for anybody out there, that's something to think about. And just hearing about how painful it is to have a weld-in 4-point and then maybe down the future wishing you had a 6-point, you know that it's not easy, and that it's not cheap, and you have to redo a lot of work. So I run a 6-point. Jeanette's running a 6-point bolt-in. Scott runs like a fully welded, crazy chassis, FIA style cage, and there's everything in between: Honda Civics, Integras, Miatas, S2000s, all that stuff. So I challenge you guys, after talking about this a little bit, to think about what you want to do. And then when you think about what you want to do, think about the budget that you have and what you're willing to do personally. Maybe you're not comfortable with installing a 4-point roll bar in your Miata. Maybe you have a friend who does. Or maybe you can reach out to the community and find somebody that you don't have to pay, $125 an hour to do to help you. Or maybe you take that as a consideration that, like, I'm not a professional. I don't want to get hurt, and the reason I'm using this is for safety, and I'm okay paying somebody, $1,000 or $1,200 or $1,500 to install a component like that. So ask yourself, make sure you're comfortable with. Be honest with yourself what you're comfortable with doing. Think about why you want it. Just to be cool on a hot day, you be a hot boy on a hot day. It's a bitch to get in and out of these things, especially when your car's on fire. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. And I mean, in a street car, it's not the safest thing to have in a street car that you're going to daily drive every day. because these bars hurt if you hit them or they hit you. But in some areas, some ways, you can protect yourself. Like most organizations require it, but I've got a dual density foam piece anywhere that could be close to my head or the passenger's head. Got them in the front, the rear, when I'm strapped in. If I can hit anything with my, even remotely close with my helmet, it's padded. Um, so yeah, if you're running, if you're not running wheel to wheel and your car's not getting log booked, this is an in excess. You do not need this to do time trials or time attack. You don't need this to do most time trials and time attack. Now, with some of the SCCA, when you're on slicks, they want you to go to at least a 4-point. That's part of their thing. NASA, I don't think they really have any requirements except for maybe unlimited, any cage requirements. Grid Life and Global Time Attack. Once you get to like track mod, they want you to have at least a roll bar. So, so you do have to think about the classes you're going to before people even start inspecting it. So even if you have it done, and even if nobody inspects it for 10 years, make sure that the person who's installing it is familiar with your car, is familiar with the rules, even long term. Say that like I don't like maybe you know so little about racing. All you know is that you want to be the next I don't know, Sebastian Loeb, and you want to be flying up the mountain of Pikes Peak someday, and you just got this little Fiesta ST that you want to race, and you want to make sure you get the right cage. Like, it doesn't mean you have to know the organization that you're running with or any of that stuff, but you do have to at least know that there's a potential for that. And then you know the prices now and what to expect. It's easier to kind of plan and budget for that. I've had people shocked about what the cages cost. I've had people think that it's not too bad. Even drag racing. In drag racing, you have to have, depending on how fast you go, drag racing is kind of a similar thing. Somebody says, all right, what do you think that you're going to take your car to? You think you're going to go faster than 9 seconds? Do you think you're going to go faster than 8 seconds? Like, how fast do you think you'll want to go with this car eventually? Because if you think that you want to go 8 seconds or faster, it's going to be a different cage than one that's like a 9-second cage. And it's so different that it's not like adding on to it. It's so different in the sense that you are now having to cut all that stuff out, and now you're cutting the floor out and stuff, and you're paid $6,000 for a cage, and now you're spending $10,000 for an 8-second cage. So those are all definitely things to consider, regardless of what you're doing, if you want to do a cage. But yeah, I think that's pretty much sums it up. That gives you an idea of costs. Costs on bolt-in cages. I know I talked about Jeanette's cage being $2,000, but there are cheaper cages. I'm not saying that you should look. I'm not saying that that's acceptable, but I mean, there's a 4-point version of her cage that they sell. There's also a Auto Power sells them. Hard Dog, for the Miatas and for the S3000s, they sell them in all different orientations and a lot of different things like that. I mean, a lot of bolt-in options too for convertibles that are pretty trustworthy, known brands. Like I think it's Hard Dog, whatever it is. At least you know that there's solid brands out there. So perhaps you want to buy a cage that's pre-bent and pre-built, and you want to weld it yourself. I applaud you, hands down. There's multiple things that can go wrong. One, you got to make sure that the cage that you're buying is at least the right bar diameter and the right configuration for what you want to do. I know this is a common setup that you see with drift cars. I've seen stuff like this for drift E36s and just random stuff like that. Make sure that it's actually a safe cage. And two, make sure you know what you're doing with welding. Like this isn't a joke. You put this weld-in cage together and you do a poor job, it not only might have fail inspection when you get to the racing that you want to do, but up to that point, if you get into an accident, God forbid, and this bar just flies out of there, I mean, not only does it not protect you from what's hitting you, but it's also in your lap on top of everything else. I mean, the top joints, all that stuff. Make sure that you are 100% confident in it. And I reckon if you are, you're probably not watching this video. But if you aren't, and you think you might be, and you are watching this video, just make sure that it's absolutely the right cage. Even call them, talk to them. You know, maybe it is just a drift car. I reckon as long as your welds are good, something is better than nothing. But anything that's too small or not spec'd right for the weight of your car, it could potentially kill you. And that's the difference, that you have to consider. That these things are not just for looks. A poorly assembled, poorly put together one. Here's I've seen some pictures that Brian has, like cars, cages he's cut out of the cars. Just how terrifying they are. No penetration in the welds, not fully welded 360. Like all of this has to be welded 360 degrees, even in parts that are hard to get to. Like that all has to be 360-degree welded, and that's really tough. Yeah, I think when Scott did his, he had the windshield out and the back glass out, and he literally put the cage, he propped it up on its plinth boxes at the very, very end, and then welded it to the box. So I mean, it's a lot of work and it's super crazy. So that is the other option. I'm not recommending it. I have seen them for pretty cheap. I've looked into them myself for my E36, but definitely things to think about and to consider. So either way, I hope that I answered some questions for you, and I really appreciate your time. Subscribe and like, and hit the notification bell. We've got a lot of stuff coming up. As you can see, the whole car is pretty much stripped down, as far as the exterior bits go, and the reason that's happening is there's some fancy exterior bits coming from the car. We still got a lot to cut out of the car, to try and add some clearances and some room. But overall, yeah, this is my WRX, and we got a lot going on this summer. So stay tuned, and we'll catch you later. The start of the cage here. This is coming up from the forward bars, so you can see the big floor plate. Sorry, it's a little bit dirty. The big floor bars come up and go across. You can kind of see that one. And it goes and ties into the main hoop, and then the main hoop has a diagonal bar for support, and then the harness bars. You can see the door bars. On driver's side's a regular one. The passenger side is a simple one, mostly for weight. You can see here those also big plates there that the cage is welded to, on both sides. And then you can see the same thing on these down joints here. So on this cage, all the floor plates are MIG welded, but all the rest of the cage is TIG welded. So this is one that Denver Donut Shop did. There's your windshield bar, kind of like to keep it from collapsing up there. But this is your basic standard 6-point NASA bar.